Like Ron said, I found my first big dinosaur bone when I was in second grade. I was just coming home for lunch one day, second grade, and decided to take a shortcut up through an alleyway. In those days, the alleys they ran behind the houses, and that's where your trash was, and so on. And then the alleyways were not really paved, but they laid gravel down on these things. And I always had my eyes on the gravel because the gravel came from the Yellowstone River. And the Yellowstone River is known for its Montana moss agates. And so I started collecting Montana moss agates also when I was in second grade. And one of the workers must have kicked this big rock out of the way. It was half buried off the roadway there. And I recognized it instantly, but got it down there and pawed it out. And it was the big end of a femur, so it was about like this. Femur's, of course, this bone right here, and it was the end part of it. Probably a sauropod or a long neck dinosaur. And so that kind of set the direction of my life, and spent a lot of time in the local Carnegie Library. My mother was the librarian for Bighorn County in Montana, and so we got always first dibs on looking at the new books and stuff like that were coming out. And I spent a lot of Saturdays reading every book I could on dinosaurs and fossils and things like this. And it was kind of turning my heart in a different direction, too. I had been raised with the stories of Adam and Eve and the Bible and so on, but the more I read these books, the more the conflict started to come up in my own life, and ultimately led to kind of a parting of the ways with my folks when I was in high school. And then I went off to college. I went to a very liberal university, the University of Kansas. We had a Jayhawk back there, is that right? Yeah, and my wife's a Jayhawk. By the way, Vicki and I are celebrating our 39th anniversary today. And Heinz consistently does this. I've always, in the last several years, it was scheduled to be on this day or right around it every year. Anyway, she's back there. She'll be at the table too to answer questions. And so while I was at the University of Kansas, I was a senior and became a believer. And the first thing I knew I needed to do, because of the conflicts that I had been raised with in secular geology, was to solve the problem. Here we got a big contradiction between what I learned in so-called science and what I had learned in the Bible. And so I really made a decision at that point. Either the Bible was all true or it was all suspect. And so the first book I read on the subject was probably the only book I knew of on the subject at the time, and that was the Genesis Flood, Henry Morris. And read that book, and I think my first reaction was anger, because, of course, I studied geology, and none of this information was disclosed to me. And I thought, this would have been very useful information as we were talking about the rock formations. And then it began to dawn on me that, well, what we were talking about was really not science at all, but a worldview war. It was them and us. And that was made very, very clear to me. And so I began to pursue a different course of action, and have been working ever since, just trying to help make the issues of geology very, very clear. In my worldview, the Genesis flood is really the most critical part of Earth history. If the Genesis flood was true history, everything else is a moot point. Evolution is a moot point. The age of the universe is a moot point, because the Genesis flood would mean that all the rock layers that we see were laid down rapidly and catastrophically. And so this is what I chose to really concentrate on. And we're involved a lot with homeschool groups all across the country. We go to about a dozen homeschool conventions every year and speak and help families understand this stuff. To me, it is just unthinkable that we could be teaching our kids earth science, either 4th grade or 8th grade, and that's it. It's the most important subject out there. You know, it's the biggest dividing point in the church today, the age of the earth. More churches split very angrily over that issue than just about any other issue. And I think the reason is that we don't spend enough time teaching our kids and learning it ourselves. We don't know our history book. We can barely tell you which chapters the flood are in. We don't know where the genealogy of Adam is. We don't know much about Abraham and the Tower of Babel. It's really very clearly laid out in the scripture. We don't know even how Egypt began. We rely on the secularists to tell us. And of course, what they tell us undermines the scriptures. So this is really something I think we're very deficient in as the church, as a Christian community. And we need to spend more time getting equipped ourselves with the historical framework of the scriptures and equipping our kids and our grandkids. Now, I have 3 kids and 3 grandkids. And so, yeah, I've started in on the grandkids. So it's just very, very important. Before I get started, some of the stuff on the Ice Age today, I've got a book back there called Bedrock Geology. It's got a section on understanding the Ice Age from scriptural perspective. This little booklet, Genesis Rock Solid, has changed more lives. I never intended it to do that. This is my first book. But this college students really request this book. A lot of college students have. It outlines the history of modern geology, how we really got it. And in this book, The Geology of Yellowstone, I grew up very near Yellowstone. I've been there probably 4 dozen times or so. And there is a lot of the Ice Age exposed in Yellowstone. Yellowstone was probably covered by about 3,000 to 5,000 feet of ice at one point. And so we go through Yellowstone, we look at the evidence for that and how it fits within a biblical perspective. And for the kids, I even have genuine mammoth tusk back there. So look for that back there. This one, this particular mammoth tusk is from Idaho, where there were a number of them. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Genesis and the Ice Age. Here are a lot of questions that I get asked about the Ice Age. It's a very little understood subject in the church. In fact, I was almost fired from teaching at a Christian high school. My job was to take kids through Scripture, 4 years. They'd get through every verse of the Scripture. And so we start the freshmen in Genesis. And of course, freshmen are going to ask me questions they would never ask their parents. And so one of the most common questions was, Mr. Nurre, Ice Age is not mentioned in the Bible. Isn't this a big contradiction? And so I'd go through explaining some things and how that would fit with Genesis. Well, that night I did that. Kids went home all excited. Pieces were fitting together, you know, in their own minds. And the parents, I had about a half a dozen parents call the principal of the school and demand that I be fired for teaching evolutionary doctrine. And what really occurred to me was that we, in a lot of ways, are just ignorant of our own Earth history and how it fits together. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do tonight. But here are some of the questions I get asked. Was there an Ice Age? Was there really an Ice Age? What is an Ice Age? Is there evidence for an Ice Age? How does it fit with the Bible? Does the idea of an Ice Age contradict the Bible? You know, geologists tell us that the last Ice Age began about 2 million years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. But that's not the only Ice Age in Earth history, they say. There's some, when I was growing up as a kid, I was taught that there were 4 major Ice Ages. Today, they think there might have been 25 Ice Ages throughout Earth history. I mean, what are you to do with this? The Bible doesn't even give a hint that there was an Ice Age. So where does it fit? Obviously, the evidence is there. We just need to know how to interpret it. And what would cause an Ice Age and what would cause it to end? You know, this is one of the biggest mysteries in modern geology. If you listed the top 10 geological mysteries in secular Earth history, Ice Age would be right up there at the top. The reason is that geologists don't know how you would trigger an ice age. The weather is either too cold or it's not cold at the times where it needs to be cold. And then how do you end an ice age? That's the other big mystery. So they don't have any more answers than the church does. So I want to take some time to do that. This is Louis Agassiz. He's Swiss-born. He came to the United States. This is where geology was beginning to really pick up, new geology in America in the 1830s. Although we were highly influenced by Europe as the changes were taking place there, a lot of new things were happening in America. And so as he began to relate features that he saw in Switzerland, he reminded people who were listening to him that there were many of these same features in America. And he is called today the father of modern glaciology. And in 1837, he called it an ice event. He never did call it an ice age. He called it an ice event. And I think that's more appropriate. This idea of an ice age incorporates these vast amounts of time, 2 million years ago. Can you imagine what 1 million years is or what 2 million years is? I don't think anybody can really fathom in their minds what 1 million years is. We can think back, we can go to the Civil War, we can go to the Revolutionary War, we can go to some of Egyptian history. Boy, I'll tell you, but even that begins to tax the power of the mind. And but now trying to comprehend 1 million and 2 million years, that is a long, long, long time. And the people who listened to him at the time just thought he was nuts. This was a brand new idea, the idea of an ice event. And they thought that the earth was still cooling down from a molten ball of lava. And so the idea of an ice event was just real strange to him. Louis Agassiz also is known for being an anti-Darwinist. He just thought Darwin was kind of nuts and was kind of a thorn in his side. So where do we put an ice event then within a biblical context? Well, let me tell you, I think when we start, I would recommend that we start with the greatest geological event in all of Earth history, aside from the creation, and that would be the Genesis flood. The Genesis flood is the key to understanding the world's great geological mysteries. It's the key to understanding the Grand Canyon. It's the key to understanding all the fossils that we find. And the beautiful fossils we find. It's the key to understanding these things out on the table there. You're going to see thunder eggs, we call them. No one's ever seen a thunder egg form today. We just find thousands of them all over the world. And they're beautiful. You cut them open. They've got wonderful, beautiful mineral patterns on the inside. They're lava nodules that have beautiful minerals on the inside. And those are not being produced today. I think the Genesis flood really provides some of the answers to that. We need to realize that the Genesis flood changed everything. How many of us have gone to the mountains and have been really kind of awestruck by God's handiwork in the mountains? And I have to tell people as we're up in the mountains, we're talking about the flood, and I say, well, here's another way to look at that. I think what we're seeing is but a remnant of the original creation. What we're seeing here is the judgment of God. The flood was an act of judgment by God. And so we see the effects of that judgment in everything we look at around us now. The earth before the flood was nothing like what we see today. We're only seeing just a glimpse of what God created. Now we can see a lot of things about God, but the earth was totally changed by the flood. When we can come to grips with that, then I think you can begin to take that and interpret a lot of what we find around here. The bone beds, the vast fossil sheets that are around, and even the ice event. Now, secular geologists teach us that the Earth came into existence about 4.6 years ago from a hot molten glob of rock. Now, this is what they think it looked like, called the Hadean Eon. And they named it that because, of course, that means Hades. And Hades is this place where everybody, suffers and is tortured and everything else. So they think this is what the early Earth looked like, is right here. Of course, right away we can see there is a huge contradiction between their view and the scriptural view. Peter said, "For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water." So it's just the opposite. We have a perspective of earth began in water, now it will end in fire. But it began in water, totally contradictory to the secular view of things. And a lot of times we'll accept their words, we'll accept their ideas. After all, scientists are supposed to be brilliant people, and they're the ones who studied this stuff, and so they should know the answer. And we buy it. And consequently, we miss a lot of what the Scripture does reveal to us about the history of the earth. The Bible addresses both the creation of the earth and a global flood. These are the two big geological events in earth history, and the Bible does talk about them a lot. Now, because the Bible is history, it serves as a framework. As a history, it doesn't tell us all the details, many details we'd really love to know, but we're only given glimpses. But it does provide a framework in which to work. And that framework is historical. If you were to put it down on paper, this is what you would get. It's really about a 5-event history, kind of just to focus in on it. The first part of this framework was the creation week, 6 days of God's work and then 7th day of rest. Just a straightforward reading of creation gives us this idea. You have to do a lot of gymnastics to change this. Then the pre-flood period between the creation and the flood was approximately 1,656 years. And it begins with the chronology and genealogy of Adam in Genesis chapter 5. First couple of verses of Genesis 5 talks about God creating man and woman on the 6th day of creation. And then it says, when Adam was 130 years old, he gave birth to Seth. He had a son, named him Seth. Now, that wasn't his only son. Adam and Eve had lots of children, but Seth, the word means substitute. And so we've got a line that's established from Adam to Seth, and of course that is the line that both Noah and Abraham are from. But when you look at that passage, all you need to do is ask the question, okay? Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth as a son. He was created on the 6th day of creation. How old was the earth when Seth was born? 130 years plus 6 days, 7 days with a day of rest. Isn't that right? It's just that simple, and it's that clear. Now, there are a lot of genealogies in the Scripture, but this one and another one in Genesis 10 is unique in that it is both a genealogy and a chronology. It tells you exactly when the patriarch was born and when exactly his son was born. You can trace that through Noah. So that's the pre-flood world. We don't know much about that world. It was completely destroyed by the flood. Then you have the flood period, which is broken into two distinct periods. The depositional stage of the flood through day 150, when everything that was land-dwelling and air-breathing on the earth died. and it was covered. Then at day 151 starts this new period that we call the recessional stage of the flood. This is when we get all the waters off of the earth. You bury the earth in water, and now you got to get the water off. And there was a particular event between those two that happened that's mentioned in Scripture. The particular period that concerns the Ice Age, of course, is that last period, the post-flood period, lasts with an Ice Age lasting about 300 to 700 years in there. And we'll look at how we got those figures. But what this historical framework tells us is that Earth's geological history was rapid, was catastrophic, and was global. That you can draw at least that much from this biblical historical framework. Now, there are two frameworks that are used to interpret the landforms, the rocks, and the fossils all around us. And the first framework that is used, it claims to be history. It's called the uniformitarian framework. And it was developed by this guy here, Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell actually took the concept of uniformitarianism from the guy who came before him, which was James Hutton, the father of modern geology. But he popularized it. Lyell was not a geologist. He was an attorney. And they said that he was brilliant in the way he presented things. But his interest was geology. And so he popularized uniformitarianism. A way to remember uniformitarian framework is this: small and slow and long ago. Isn't that an easy way to remember it? Rather than trying to figure out, what was that? What? Small and slow and long ago. I learned this from Gary Parker years ago. And so that really describes uniformitarianism. Small geological changes over a vast amount of time is what uniformitarianism teaches. It's still taught today. It's the foundation of modern geology. And it's because of this concept and this framework that we get the idea that an ice age started, or at least the last one, 2 million years ago and ended 10,000 years ago. It's because of the uniformitarian way of thinking. Rapid, catastrophic events to a secular geologist today only really occur on local levels. In fact, when I studied geology, if I had used the word catastrophe in any of my papers, I would have flunked. This is how dirty of a word it was way back then. But beginning in about the late 70s, geologists began to recognize, especially the younger ones, they began to recognize that catastrophes had played an important part in our Earth history. Just nothing to do with Noah's catastrophe. And I remember I never expected to see this. I was in a bookstore. It was actually at Mount St. Helens I noticed this, and looking for the latest book. And there on the shelf was a book called the Washington's Catastrophic Past. And I thought, whoa, I have never seen that. This was many years ago. But yes, they began to shift a little bit, but only locally. And uniformitarianism plays a big part of that. Lyell's book, you see it there, called Principles of Geology, is still in print today. It's used in many colleges. It's considered the creme de la creme of geology books from the 1800s. Still has a lot of influence, even though he's been dead for a long, long time. The geology of the earth must be explained in terms of processes we can see now, slow and incremental. Now, this is kind of an example of it. This particular picture here is of observed erosion. Most of us are familiar with this kind of a thing, especially some of you as farmers. I don't know how many we have in here, but this is typical erosion. You get a major rain, and you get a little bit of a river running through your field. Some of the crops wash out and so on. Nobody denies that happens, and we can observe it. The belief, though, by uniformitarians is that present-day erosion produces huge canyons over millions of years. Do you see how we made the jump from science to philosophy? Do you see that? One of them is science. We can observe it. We can measure the rate of erosion and so on. But to say that produces this over millions of years, now that is a huge jump. Why? Because this erosion has never been observed. We've only seen localized erosion. The one thing that both creation geologists and uniformitarian geologists do agree on is that both were the result of water. It's just how much water. And of course, those of us who are biblicists see that, well, from the historical framework, we see there was a lot of water involved. If it was global and everything that was land-dwelling, air-breathing on the earth died at day 150 of the flood, that was a global catastrophic event. And so we begin to see this happen as a result. The second framework is the biblical historical framework, and a little saying for this one is big and fast and in the recent past. So kids, if you're wanting to figure out how to remember these, get that little rhyme going, and this is a good way to do it. Sure, the Bible speaks of big events. Creation was a big event, and it happened in the recent past, 6,000 years ago. The flood, 4,500 years ago. So big and fast and in the recent past. And of course, seeing the Grand Canyon, we'd expect that the flood would have produced this kind of thing. It doesn't surprise us at all. And you see the Colorado River down there in the bottom. Secular geologists say that that was what carved the canyon. I don't think so. I think what we're looking at is the remnant of what originally carved the canyon. Big and fast in the recent past. And now what we see is slow erosion taking place through wind, river erosion, rain, freeze, thaw. But that certainly isn't the answer to how this canyon was carved. So our biblical historical framework then, we want to focus in on one aspect of this to look at the ice event, and that is the post-flood period. We're still in that period. It includes the last 4,500 years. And a lot of things have happened in this particular time period, much different than the kind of life that was lived before the flood. One of the things you can see in the fossil record is the abundance of plants. And there must have been a tremendous amount of oxygen that we don't really share that much today. Carbon dioxide was a big, big deal. How about methane gas, one of those big greenhouse gases, that's supposed to be destroying the earth because we all have pets and drive big SUVs. Well, methane gas and carbon dioxide are two gases that help hold the heat in from the sun. If we didn't have any of those, we'd probably get too cold here. But it has the effect of trapping the sun's heat, and that helps us. One of the things I like to joke about a lot is that, when I was a kid, we'd go to Yellowstone, and we'd rarely see buffalo. We'd see a lot of grizzlies, we'd see a lot of black bears, see a huge number of elk, and moose, lots of moose. And of course, then the Park Service started getting involved in saving the buffalo. And so today, because of their efforts, buffalo approach the numbers of about 5,000 buffalo in the park. Can you imagine? That's a huge amount of flatulence that are produced in the atmosphere. And so I want to know who is going to pay for that mess. So we're really concerned with the last 4,500 years immediately following the flood. So now we have a direct tie-in with the flood. How did the flood work here? So I would put the ice event right there in our biblical historical framework. Now, is there evidence for an ice event? Well, there's actually quite a bit, and particularly in the northern hemisphere, in Antarctica, and in the higher latitudes. For instance, this is Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. It's a volcano, and at 19,000 feet, there is a massive glacier on Mount Kilimanjaro. So we need to figure out, well, what would that be doing there? So these are good evidences. We don't see this kind of ice and snow really form today. We see smaller glaciers form. One of the amazing things about Mount St. Helens is here recently they discovered that there is a good-sized glacier forming around the cone within the blown out dome of Mount St. Helens. And this was hidden, I think, for a long time because the snow on it was pretty dirty from the volcanic rock and so on. But as they confirmed it, this has become a glacier and it is moving. Kind of neat, huh? Right there in Mount St. Helens. Now, in the United States, we have lots of evidence, particularly across the northern part of the United States, and in many of the residuals from what we call ice age lakes or ice event lakes. Near where I grew up, was a big flood there, very similar to the Missoula flood, called the Great Falls Glacial Lake flood. And it flooded out a lot of Montana. And when we go to do our dinosaur digging there, a lot of those dinosaur badlands in there were washed out and affected by the floodwaters from this flood. We also find about 100 feet depth of rounded stones, agates, bones, petrified wood, things that really are not natural to the area. We find a lot of that there. So this is some more evidence that something big happened. Then there are glacial troughs. These are quite common around the world. This particular one is in the Beartooth Mountains, and it's several miles long and about 1,200, 1,500 feet deep. Now, that's a lot of ice moving through there. But they don't get that kind today. They get 15 feet of snow, but not 1,000 feet of ice. You can always tell a glacial trough because they're U-shaped. And that's because of how a glacier moves and how it rounds out things. This is in contrast to a V-cut canyon. This one is also in the same area. This is the Gardner Canyon, and it's very clear. This canyon was cut by water. And the V-cut canyon, similar to the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, is also a V-cut canyon. And so there are the two types. Geologists readily recognize this. They just have trouble sometimes explaining some of the catastrophic nature of these things. Another piece of evidence, glacial boulders that are called erratics. This is in Yellowstone. Now, Yellowstone Park is a volcanic park. There's lava everywhere you go. Well, this boulder, and hundreds like it spread across Yellowstone, is granite. Where did the granite come from, and how did it get there? And that's what we call an erratic. It's really rock in areas where it just should not be. It's not natural to the area. In the northeastern part of Yellowstone, you see this. You see these granite boulders just dot the landscape, and they're not rounded. They are eroded somewhat, but not by water tumbling, but more like glacial movement. Well, one of the nearest sources, or the nearest source to this area for granite, is the mountains in the background there. Those are the Beartooth Mountains, which there's a lot of granite there. And that's 50 miles away. So the extent of the snow and ice that would have had to move these huge boulders, some of these are as big as a small house. They're huge. I mean, the force would have been pretty amazing. Now, a state that you probably don't think about when you think of the ice event is Kansas. In the northeastern part of Kansas, there is a rock called the Sioux Quartzite. It's a very pretty quartzite, kind of a reddish color, and it is a metamorphic rock. Now, Kansas is predominantly sedimentary. This was planed as the floodwaters receded off the Rocky Mountains and spread fossils all over the place. in the plains. But this quartzite is up around the northeastern section of Kansas. The closest source they think of its origination is most likely Canada. This is abundant in Canada. It's spread across Minnesota. Well, how did it get there from Canada? Well, that's something worth considering for this ice. There's another feature of ice event, and that is glacial loess or glacial less. It's a fine wind-blown rock flower, and it's spread all over the Midwest section. Now, this is distinct from the Dust Bowl. This is dust. Look at how thick it is and how deep it is. It's all over the Midwest. And in fact, it's all over the world. You see the little green splotches there on the map. That's where these big outcrops of loess is, or less. And it is worldwide. These are indicative of huge dust storms. And again, they are related to the ice event. Spread across Minnesota, Ohio, and even Washington are features that we call striations. This is where glaciers, as snow builds up and packs down, builds ice, and then it begins to move just by way of gravity. And as it does, it acts like a road grader. It picks up pebbles and stones underneath and then scratches the bedrock below. And so you get these striation patterns all over the place. And it's pretty indicative of an ice event. Northeastern Oregon, Lake Wallowa. Some of you have probably been there. That lake there was formed by glacial melt. And notice on either side of it are these, almost looks like dikes. Those are glacial moraines. Again, when the glacier moves, it acts like a road grader. It pushes stuff out of the way. Forms lateral moraines and terminal moraines. And there you see them both there. These are about 700 feet high, the moraines. This is quite a large glacier. Here you can see a glacial feature called a cirque up there at the top. It's an amphitheater, very similar to a glacial trough, but it's a rounded out amphitheater where a glacier was moving. And then there's a glacial valley on the side there. The Tetons, you can readily see them in the Tetons. Horns are an example of glacial cutting. These are in the Beartooth Mountains and the Tetons. France or Switzerland has its own version of a horn, and the Matterhorn is a glacially cut pinnacle. But these are horns, and they were cut as glaciers moved around the less resistant rock and cut it out. You can see the glacial lake at the bottom, the moraine that held the lake in as the glacier melted. And then you can see the glacial valley there in front, that U-shaped valley. These things are all open. You kind of have to look for them. And if you're observant and then you apply your framework, you can begin to interpret these things and put them in some kind of a historical context. This much ice demands a catastrophic origin and explanation. The Tetons are 13,000 feet high. There's evidence that the ice was every bit that high. And so there was a lot of ice. In fact, geologists estimate that the entire Yellowstone area, including the Tetons, was covered by as much as 5,000 feet of ice. That is a lot of stuff, and that's truly catastrophic. So secularists tell us that the Ice Age began about 2 million years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. And they call this period of time the Pleistocene Epoch. You've probably heard of this, the Pleistocene. That's really associated with the mammoths and other Ice Age critters. I have a few things out here. I do have a mammoth tooth or a molar, as well as some mammoth tusk. These were dredged up from the North Sea. And you can see those back there, as well as a saber-toothed cat skull. It's a replica of one that was found in the La Brea tar pits in California. And then there's the pig from hell. Kids, don't miss that one if you haven't seen him. He looks pretty ferocious. I don't know whether he was a pig or not. I don't think anybody really knows. They apparently are extinct today because they were huge. But he was kind of serious looking. And anyway, he's typically associated with animals. Where he came from, I am not sure. Could he have been related to an animal came off the ark? I'm guessing that was probably the case. And then it's probably a variation. He wasn't, it wasn't very prolific. We find a few of his bones here and there, but we do have some skulls. This one's a reproduction of Entelodon. So you can see that. Now, the Pleistocene Epoch, again, was named by Charles Lyell. He's the one who really gave us most of the modern geology that we study today. The word Pleistocene, you'd think means, well, it means Ice Age. No, it really doesn't. The word means newest. Newest. And you have Pliocene and Eocene and so on. So it's new, more new, newest, and so on. That's what we get in these meanings. Well, why did he name it newest? Actually, it has nothing to do with an ice event or an ice age. In that particular period of Lyell's life, you can see that Agassiz had just delivered his address on an ice event. And but the paleontologists and the geologists of the time, they weren't even considering this. So how did he name it newest? These were actually named after fossil shells that were found in Sicily, where it was discovered that 70% of the animals represented by the fossil shells were still living. And so they called this period the newest. It was actually just a layer of rock that contained shells that look very much like we have today. Probably the topmost layers of the flood, what was deposited by the flood. But he wouldn't accept that in his day. They had to have some kind of time signature on them. And in fact, this gives you a clue as to how they date the rock layers. They're dated by the fossils. If you want to know how old a rock layer is, you've got to be able to answer the question, well, what kind of fossils does it have? See, fossils are really tied into everything. In fact, fossils are always the fallback. And why? Because it's based on a belief that fossils represent an evolutionary history of life. And so the rocks themselves represent time, and they represent a progression of time and life. Well, how do we know that? By the fossils. That's how we know how old the rocks are. But the starting point, see, you're getting into a little bit of a circle here. What we have to believe in order to make that work is that evolution took place. Well, that in itself is a huge assumption. And it's not science, it's philosophy. Science is something you can observe, test, and repeat. But certainly we can't test and observe evolution. Evolutionists themselves tell us that, hey, it takes too long. So it's a belief that fossils represent an evolutionary history of life. Now, if we look at our own biblical historical framework, it simply will not allow a 2 million year old ice age. So geologists have got to have, they've got to have made a mistake somewhere. And we really need to help them find it. This is where I would put the ice event, right there, right after the flood. And it would make perfect sense. There were 3 major events of the flood that would trigger an ice event. The first one is found in Genesis 7:11. Actually, this picture you're looking at is in New Zealand. It's part of the Great Atlantic Rift, big crack in the earth that runs around the earth right through Iceland. And this is the remnant of it right here. And here's the passage: in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, in the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. This crack here is made of magma, just solid magma. And it would make sense that this really relates to it. So we know this much cracking in the earth and releasing of all kinds of stuff, nasty stuff, gases, ash, and would have weakened the crust. It's kind of like taking an egg. You know, egg looks pretty solid, but if you drop the thing and you produce a crack in it, all of a sudden, I mean, it's pretty weak. And so this would definitely have weakened the earth and produced a lot of things that were totally changed. I personally believe this is where the present radioactivity that we find all over the earth, and in the flood rocks of Utah and Wyoming, sedimentary rocks are a big place, the sandstones there, where we find uranium. And it's mixed in all the flood rocks. And I really think it came from the breaking up of the fountains of the Great Deep. So that's really the first major event that would have helped trigger an ice event. Second major event was day 151. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided, and the water receded steadily from the earth. This was another 150 some days. And, well, that much water passing over rock layers that have just laid down would have produced all kinds of erosion and further weakening the crust of the earth. Day 151 is found in Psalm 104, and it says this: "You covered it with the deeps as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away." Now notice this next part: the mountains rose, and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that the waters may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. And you look at that, and as a geologist I look at that, well, that's a lot of tectonic activity. You know, the Tetons rise straight up out of the floor of the plain there that they rest on, just straight up. And vertical uplift, several thousand feet of vertical uplift. This would have also caused a lot of fresh volcanic activity. Whenever you've got this much movement in the crust, you're talking about generating a lot of volcanic activity. So you have catastrophic planation or shearing. Notice the flat tops in the background there. Geologists are mystified by this. Why would you have a lot of erosion down below and flat tops on top of these things? What kind of process would cover that? This is another one of those big mysteries. Well, I think it's clear. If you've got a lot of water rushing off of the earth, you can plane something very, very quickly. And then channelization, catastrophic cutting. Those were part of the flood. And then this last feature in Psalm 104 would have produced the eruption of supervolcanoes. These supervolcanoes are interesting because the lavas don't show birth underwater. They erupted above water, and Yellowstone is a good example of that. Yellowstone is called a supervolcano. Its crater, by the way, is 45 miles long and 35 miles wide. That's set in opposition to Mount St. Helens, which is roughly a mile across for its crater. I mean, that's a huge volcano. And that would have coughed up a lot of aerosols into the atmosphere. 14 supervolcanoes have been discovered to date. Now, no one has ever seen one of these things erupt. We find remnants of them. Yellowstone is one example. The Mammoth Caldera system in California is another one. Mount Mazama is considered another one. So, I mean, there are just a bunch of these, but 14 supervolcanoes have been discovered to date. The kind of ejecta from these volcanoes produced a lot of catastrophic stuff. The Absaroka Range, the volcanic chain, it runs the northeastern part of Yellowstone and down the east side, produced 9,000 cubic miles of volcanic material. And this is set against the 0.25 cubic miles of stuff that was produced from Mount St. Helens. So this, you're talking about, this is a world of hurt right here. And in addition to that, there's also the 26 major basalt flows, like the Columbia basalt flows in Washington, that have been discovered. These are huge provinces of lava. Some places in the Washington basalt flows reach close to 2 miles thick. I mean, that's a huge amount of lava. You don't get that kind of lava today in Hawaii. It flows for a while, it produces several feet, but not close to 1 mile to 2 miles of it. Well, this basalt, hot basalt erupting at 1900 degrees would have also generated a lot of poisonous gases and a lot of ash into the atmosphere. And it would have heated a lot of water, producing a lot of evaporation. So within the biblical context, how did an ice age or an ice event begin and end? Well, you've got to have two things that happen. This is what they're not observing today. We get glaciers, we do get snowfall, we get bad winters sometimes. But what we need is a combination of, number one, warmer water. So the fountains of the great deep would have increased evaporation. And all that would have produced a lot of moisture going up into an atmosphere that was cooled by the thousands of tons of volcanic aerosols that were released, blocking the sun's reflective energy. And so that moisture rising into the atmosphere would have fallen back to the earth in catastrophic snowfall. And then, of course, it wouldn't have taken much time for the snow to pack down, turn to ice, and then start moving. The net effect was this: ideal atmospheric conditions, cooler summers, warmer winters. A lot of people think that in order to get an ice age, you have to have severe cold. Well, no, you don't produce moisture in severe cold. You need cooler summers where the snow does not melt, but you need warmer winters that generate a lot of moisture. So this is really one of the net effects of what the flood, post-flood would have produced. You need catastrophic snowfall, ideal conditions for glacier formation. These glaciers are very, very thick. If you've ever been to Alaska, some of the glaciers up there, I mean, are huge. These are remnants of what took place shortly after the flood. And then, of course, this would all produced rapid changes in the atmosphere, especially as the volcanic aerosols would have died back. Then you're going to have the sun's reflective energy start melting at a catastrophic rate. And this is where you get floods like the Missoula flood, the Great Lake Falls flood, the Bonneville flood, or the Lake Bonneville flood, and other kinds of conditions, catastrophic snowmelt. There are two modern examples that would illustrate this. One is Krakatoa in 1883. It was a big eruption, but it was nothing like a supervolcano. But here's a report on Krakatoa. Acidic aerosols or ash clouds sufficiently blocked enough sunlight to drop the Earth's temperature by several degrees for a few years. Their presence in the atmosphere also created spectacular effects over 70% of the Earth's surface. Now, there's one thing missing from this to produce an ice event, and that is you don't have any evaporation coming up from warmer water. You have a cooler atmosphere, but you don't have the evaporation. The biggest eruption, volcanic eruption in modern recorded history is 1815, called the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. Listen to the report of Mount Tambora. Tambora erupted in 1815, killing 92,000 people. 1816 became the year without a summer. Did you ever hear that? Were you ever taught that in geography or anything? This blew me away when I read it several years ago. Wow, I didn't know that. Year without a summer. The global climatic effects were felt all over the world. Of course, aerosols from the Tambora eruption blocked out sunlight and reduced global temperatures by 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Europe missed a summer and India had crop failures. On June 4th, 1816, frosts were reported in Connecticut. And by the following day, most of New England was gripped by the cold front. On June 6, 1816, snow fell in New York and in Maine. Such conditions occurred for at least 3 months and ruined most agricultural crops in North America. Canada experienced extreme cold during the summer. 12 inches of snow accumulated near Quebec City on June 6th through the 10th, 1816. During this year, the year with no summer, 1816, many artists all over the world felt moved to write about it. And among those people were Mary Shelley, who wrote the very well-known book entitled Frankenstein. Isn't that interesting? I'm sure people thought this was the end of the world coming. To help portray the dismal feeling of 1816, Lord Byron wrote the poem Darkness in response to the weather. It is estimated that 200 million tons of sulfur dioxide were shot up into the stratosphere. The sulfur dioxide prevented much sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, lowering the overall temperature and killing crops and many creatures as a result. This crop failure caused mass famine, which was what caused the death toll to be so high. Isn't that an interesting report? Mount Tambora, and that didn't even come close to a supervolcano. So here, the combination of these effects really could answer the question, how did we get an ice event? Now, if you review these things, then that would happen. The events would be, number one, warmer oceans brought on by the breaking up of the fountains of the Great Deep, increasing evaporation. As the waters began to flee, the mountains rising, the valleys sinking, you've got volcanic eruption producing aerosols, great amounts of aerosols, which would produce a cloud cover blocking the reflective energy of the sun, and which would have resulted in a cooler atmosphere, so the evaporation then would have come back to Earth in the form of lots and lots and lots of snow. And that then is just a short hop, skip, and a jump to producing huge glaciers. And so what we're witnessing today, I know people are all upset because the glaciers in Glacier Park are melting. Well, frankly, I think that's what I would expect if I believe in the catastrophic flood and its aftermath. We are still in this post-flood period in a winding down process from the flood. That's what I really think is going on. And so I would expect glaciers to melt. The big question is not that they're melting, but how did they get there? That's the big question. And that's the question that secularists cannot really understand and answer. It's still a big mystery. So the Genesis flood is the key to understanding the Ice Age. The Genesis flood and its volcanic consequences would have provided the warm oceans, increased evaporation, cloud cover, cooler atmosphere, and cooler continents to produce a great ice event. Now, after the ice event, you've got a lot of climate change. Remember, everything changed because of the flood. No longer do you have these warm, tropic-like environments that are characterized in the fossil record. Huge plants. I've got fossils of what is called the calamite tree. Today they're called horsetails. They're no more than a few feet tall. The calamite trees were over 100 feet tall. There were huge animals, dragonflies with 2 feet wingspans are found in the fossil record. And ferns in the fossil record. You know, I've got hundreds of fossil ferns in my collection. Not one of them show what we get here in Washington, which is when a fern dies, it curls up, turns brown, and decays. In the fossil record, all of the ferns are laid out flat, which tells me that they were buried while they were still alive. So, but the amount of plant preservation in the fossil record is enormous. And it all indicates a time that was totally different than what we experience now. We experience extreme seasons. And growing up in Montana, where the coldest spot in the nation was always Cut Bank, Montana. I remember walking to school. Now, this is one of these old-timer jokes now. See, I'm a little older, so I can tell these old-timer jokes. Old-timer stories. The kids say, yeah, Mr. Nurre, I know my dad says the same thing. But there were times when we walked to school 40 below zero. I mean, I never once remember school closing when I was a kid. Not in Montana. But it was, we have extreme climate changes going on. Sometimes they're rapid, sometimes they're a little more moderate. but I think it's all a result of the flood. Weather would have become much colder after the post-flood here, period. Would have become much colder. Climate would have become much drier because of the cold air. Wind would have been much more severe due to the changed weather. And consequently, because the foliage was pretty sparse after the flood, you've got dust that would have been prevalent due to less foliage and drier conditions. And this explains the loess or less deposits worldwide. I've got some glacial loess out there on the table. You can take a look at it. In a recent historical example, this wasn't produced by the ice event, but it was produced by dry conditions and very windy conditions, and that was the Dust Bowl. The dust accumulated. Look, it's covering a lot of things. This picture here on the left is my mother-in-law's childhood home during the Dust Bowl. This is where she grew up, right here. She was just a kid when this happened. It was in western Kansas, the biggest, one of the hardest hit areas of the Dust Bowl. But that's a picture. It's in Kansas State history book. I don't know how, Vicki, how did your mom discover that? Oh, she went looking for it. Well, there it is. That was her home. And very interestingly enough, most of the preserved and partially preserved mammoths and other animals are preserved in the frozen loess. You can see here how a mammoth might have tried to weather out the cold, dry wind and ended up getting covered with glacial loess and froze as a result. So you've got a lot of preserved remains of these creatures. They're primarily found in frozen glacial loess. Post-ice event flooding from ice-filled lakes all over the place. So the biblical historical framework would teach us that there was one event, ice event caused by the Genesis flood and its catastrophic volcanic eruptions, and lasting about 300 to 700 years between Noah and Moses. Isn't it interesting when you read the story of Lot? Why did he choose what is now the most barren part of Israel? Because it was what? Lush and green. It shows you times have really changed. The deserts in Saudi Arabia were not always deserts. There were lots of evidence found there that there were thriving communities living in those areas that are now forbidding deserts. So things have changed a lot, and the flood is responsible for it. We live in a very uncertain and chaotic world today. It's there to teach us that man doesn't live by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So with that, I can open it up to a few questions here. I think you've got a mic there. If you, okay, yeah.
Second, there is. First of all, if the fellows will come, we have a clipboard with a sign-up sheet for emails and such like that from the forum. And also, while we have a few questions, if you could, if you're interested in helping with some donations to help cover the costs of the forum and our activities, please write out a check or cash is fine, and we'll do that in a few minutes after a couple questions. Any questions for Pat?
The ice map seemed to show that the glaciers were centered around the magnetic North Pole rather than the geographic North Pole. Is that true, and why?
Well, that I don't know much about that. I've primarily centered on areas involving the northern part of the United States and in Siberia. So I'm just now getting into studying about the magnetic north and polar north and so on. There's a lot of indication from different geologists that magnetic poles have shifted around. That's still a real uncertainty. So I have no idea. Snow is still there at any rate. But did you know what's underneath the snow? In the Arctic, they found dinosaur fossils. And in the Antarctica, there are petrified forests under the ice. Isn't that interesting?
I guess you haven't spoken any about dinosaurs. I was wondering how all that fits in.
Wait, you want to stay another hour or so?
That was last night.
You mean how dinosaurs fit into the ice event? Or
the flood.
oh, well, most of them were probably wiped out by the flood, but Noah did take dinosaurs on the ark. How do I know that? Well, because Job wrote about them, and Job came after the flood. In fact, he writes about behemoth, which is from the Hebrew word behema, which is the Hebrew word used for cattle in Genesis 1. Cattle implies horns and milkers and so on, but cows. But the word is behema, meaning a big land beast. And the word for sea monsters in Genesis 1 is the Hebrew word tanin. It's the word most translated as dragon in other parts of the Bible. So big sea creatures like mosasaur and megalodon would have been tanin, whereas behema would have included T-Rex and sauropods and even the giant rhinoceros that was found. Yeah, a giant rhinoceros was found in China in the 1920s in dinosaur rock layers. Can you believe that? And it was sent back to the American Museum of Natural History and buried in the archives, and there it still sits. But there are a lot of books written about it today. The giant rhinoceros was over 15 feet high, and his skull was, 7 feet long. This was a huge rhinoceros. And it was found by one of my boyhood heroes, Roy Chapman Andrews, who was the model for Indiana Jones. He was carried a pistol on his hip and a campaign hat and traveled all around the world as an explorer. He discovered that in China. And there's all kinds of that kind of stuff to show us that, these creatures were killed in the flood in sedimentary rock. And but after the flood, remember, as weather began to change, I think it resulted in a lot of extinction. I think the mammoth eventually went the way of a lot of extinction. Woolly rhinoceroses went that way. The Irish elk went that way. A lot of animals became extinct, and I think they were just unable to adjust to the changing environment and climates. So I think that explains really the full disappearance of the dinosaurs.
Other questions?
Got one right over here, Ron. Over there on your left.
Could you talk a little bit about continental drift and where that would have fit in with the whole flood and
yeah, I could.
deeps?
Now, I know this is a very controversial subject today, even among creationists. I personally do not embrace the plate tectonics idea. It is an idea only. It's never been proven to be true. When I studied geology, plate tectonics didn't exist. It was called continental drift. And one of my geologist professors thought it was heresy. So there's a lot of change that's happened. But plate tectonics is this idea that the continents were together, split apart, migrated around the globe to their present positions. That not only happened once, it happened twice in Earth history. So I just don't see the geological evidence for it. When you look at Yellowstone and the Hawaiian Islands, they're not on what geologists call plate boundaries. They're right in the middle of plates. And this is a mystery. Why would you have all this volcanic activity in a place where there's no plate boundaries, which was supposed to have triggered volcanic eruptions? Same with Yellowstone. Yellowstone occurs right in the middle of the West. It's not on any kind of plate boundaries. It's just this huge hole in the earth. And so I know a lot, there's a lot of controversy over that, but I just want to say enough that to help you realize that a lot of it is conjecture and ideas. It's never been demonstrated to be true. It really started to be developed in the late 70s, early 80s.
So you don't think that there was one giant
I do.
continent?
I do. Genesis 1 makes it clear there was one land and one sea. But what caused the continents today, I think, was directly related to the flood. The continents are tied. They're tied down by granite. And so what you see, I believe, are remnants of what the flood did. As the flood scoured out the earth and then receded, it left remnants of which we live on one. And but those is part of one continent that broke up and then moved around the globe. I don't see that evidence. That's conjecture. It's based on assumptions. But yes, I believe that Scripture teaches one land in the beginning and one sea. It's just that the flood, I believe, is what carved up that one land mass, produced our seas, and produced our continents. Very interesting, when you look at the word sea in Genesis, it's singular. It's not plural. Although it's translated in our English Bibles a lot as seas. But it's not. It's a singular Hebrew word, sea. And so the idea is one landmass and one sea. What it looked like, I have no idea. But as the flood then scoured out the earth, it tore up all the sediments, deposited them all over the place. We have, 70% of the Earth's land surface is covered by sedimentary rock today. And some of these sedimentary formations, like the Bridger Mountains in Montana around Bozeman, are estimated by geologists to be 25,000 feet thick from below up to the top of limestone. That's an awful lot of limestone. Where did it come from? And so that's kind of what I think about that. There was definitely a lot of carving up, but no movement as far as we can tell. Movement is an idea, and it's based upon the rejection of the flood. The flood was a myth, according to secular geologists, so you've got to figure out a way to explain the continents. One of the biggest problems that hounded geologists for a number of years was, why do we find fossils on one continent surrounded by water and the same fossils found on another continent? And so as they began to ponder that, they said, well, obviously the continents must have been together at one time and then separated, isolating the populations. But what happens if that was all connected? The animals had migrated, 1,600 years before the flood, spread out, formed populations, and the flood buried them, transported many of them, and isolated land masses. I mean, that is a plausible explanation, just that it's not science, it's an idea. Same with plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is not science, it's an idea. And I talk about it all the time. As an idea, I think, yeah, worth considering. But given what I know about the Scriptures, I'd have to say I don't quite accept them. Yeah.
Does the formation of the Hawaiian Islands fit into that too?
Excuse me?
The formation of the Hawaiian Islands.
The formation of them?
Yes, that's all volcanic.
Yeah, it's all volcanic. You know what? Rather than take the time to do that, buy my book back there on the table. It's called The Geology in the Hawaiian Islands. You'll get all your questions answered. Plus, Vicki and I'll be able to eat tonight.
So have you done quite a bit of fossil hunting in this area? I know,
some.
Excuse me, I have done some, and I found, huge palm fronds and so on, and along the Chuckanut Drive and so on. But I even come up with a 2-foot walrus tusk that was partially permineralized.
Yeah,
that was on Mount Baker.
I have found actually crinoid limestone on Mount Baker. What's it doing there? And Chuckanut Drive is a famous place. I've got lots of leaf fossils and things from Chuckanut Drive, bark, stems, things like that. But yeah, that stuff is pretty prolific here. There's only been one dinosaur bone found in Washington, and it was on one of the San Juan Islands. Now, how it got there, anybody's guess. But San Juan Islands, by the way, are a part of the post-flood ice event. That's what was the glaciers melted around the world, the waters rose, and it would have separated a lot of land masses, and that's why you've got the San Juan Islands.
And one last question over here.
Yeah.
Would Don Patton's book from the 1960s, he was from around this area, does it factor into any of the current reading and thinking about his book was titled The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epoch? I don't, is that
I'm not familiar with that book, but I don't know him personally, but I've read his material. I think anything is really worth considering, and so long as we know you've got to be determined that you're going to have that biblical framework. That's a non-negotiable. That does not change.
Don Patton was my college church Sunday school teacher.
Oh, he was?
And he was a PhD in geology.
Well, I've heard a lot about him. I've never had the pleasure of meeting him, Dwayne Gish and Henry Morris were people that I was most familiar with. Vicki and I would have them into our home for supper, and Dwayne Gish being from Kansas, of course, we really struck up the conversations. But some of those old timers, though, really know a lot of stuff. And I think reading as much as you can. I've got about 100 books on secular geology on my shelf. And I read them, boy, I pour through them. I read articles and keep up with it. But I always remember my biblical framework. And so I interpret everything I read and look at in light of my biblical framework.
Okay, thank you. Be sure to stop at the table, and Pat and Vicki will be there to answer more questions and show you fossils and such like that. Just a reminder, again, next month, Dr. Carter is going to be here, and I think that's the 28th here, but there's going to be meetings before that at various locations and a couple afterwards. Again, check in there's a flyer in the back, and also you can check on the website for the forum, and the details will be there, okay? Two other things, speaking of geological events, as you know, we sponsor trips to mostly to Dry Falls, the Missoula flood area over in eastern Washington during the summer and fall, and for that matter spring. I'm the one that does it, so I'll be announcing those dates shortly. And this year I'm thinking about, with another gentleman, having a 2-day deal, going over to Dry Falls and then over to Palouse Falls. Anybody been over to Palouse Falls in eastern Washington, near the Snake River? Pretty cool deal. It's all part of the Missoula flood catastrophic event that happened during the end of the Ice Age that Pat was talking about. Last item. You guys have seen these little DVDs before. These are what we call our ministry giveaway DVDs. And what that means is that we buy them at cost, $2 a piece, and we have like 16 titles and a brand new inventory of those. And these are my favorites. God of Wonders is a great one because it has a marvelous presentation of who God is and how he reflects that in his creation, plus ties in a wonderful presentation of the gospel. A lot of church guys that I know, I sell these to for $2 a piece, and they give them away to their visitors that come. It's a good idea. These two are really my favorites, along with this one. This one's about the cell and the origins of life and information science. Highly recommend this one. And this one's a new one called Cosmos, and it talks about who we are in light of the God's creation of the cosmos. It's really a marvelous one, very thought-provoking. So feel free to pick those up. So with that, I think we're done. There's some goodies in the back, and of course Pat's table, and then of course our normal table that we have with a forum with items there. So great. See you next month. Come and see Dr. Carter in his various presentations. It'll be really good.